Keith leaned back in his office chair, rubbing his tired eyes. It had been another long day of writing, or attempting to write, anyway. The words just weren't flowing like they used to. He glanced over at the ghostly figure hovering by the window, her translucent form shimmering in the moonlight streaming in. "What's the matter, Keith? Writer's block again?" Sarah asked teasingly, floating over to perch on the edge of his desk. Keith sighed. "You could say that. I just can't seem to capture the emotion and depth I want in my stories lately. They feel flat, lifeless." He chuckled humorlessly at the unintended irony of discussing lifelessness with the spirit of his deceased childhood friend. Sarah gave him a sympathetic look, her ethereal fingers passing intangibly through the papers scattered across the desk. "Maybe you need some fresh inspiration, some real emotion and drama to draw from." Keith quirked an eyebrow at her. "And I suppose you have something in mind? Usually when you get that gleam in your eye, it means trouble for me." Sarah grinned mischievously. "Oh, nothing too crazy. I just happen to know that your detective friend Chase is working a particularly juicy murder case right now. A real whodunit. I bet if you helped him solve it using our special investigative technique, it would give you plenty of exciting material for a new story." Keith frowned uncertainly. Using Sarah's ghostly ability to access a murder victim's memories always felt like an invasion of privacy, dancing on the edge of ethical boundaries. He'd done it a few times before to help Chase crack tough cases, but tried not to make a habit of it. Still, he had to admit he was intrigued, and more than a little desperate to break out of his writing rut. Against his better judgment, he felt himself starting to cave. "I don't know, Sarah. Chase only calls me in as a last resort when he's really stumped. I'm not sure I should interfere if he hasn't asked for my help yet." "Hasn't stopped you before?" Sarah pointed out with an impish smirk. "Besides, the sooner this killer is off the streets, the better, right? You could save lives. And if it just so happens to provide you with some good story fodder in the process, well, that's just a bonus." Keith rolled his eyes but couldn't suppress a small smile at her wheedling. "All right, fine, you win. Let's go check it out before I change my mind. But we're just gathering information to help Chase if he needs it. No unnecessary risks or reckless ghostly shenanigans. Got it. No promises," Sarah sing-songed with a wink as she dissipated into mist. Her disembodied voice echoed around him. "Meet you at the morgue in 10. Keith shook his head wryly as he grabbed his coat. What had he gotten himself into this time? By the time Keith arrived at the morgue, Chase was already there waiting for him, a haggard and slightly manic look in his eyes that Keith recognized all too well. The look of a detective at his wits' end grasping for any lead. "Keith, thank God you're here," Chase exclaimed, hurrying over to shake his hand. "I'm sorry to call you in so late, but I'm completely stumped on this one. This case is a real puzzler." "No worries. I'm happy to help however I can," Keith assured him, though he shot Sarah's invisible form a warning look over Chase's shoulder as she made exaggerated gagging motions at the cloying smell of death and formaldehyde permeating the cold chamber. Chase walked them over to one of the steel exam tables where a body lay draped under a crisp white sheet. Victim's name is Jerry Watkins, 32, a clerk in the city planning office. Seems he was something of a loner, not much of a social life outside of work. No clear enemies or motives that we've uncovered so far. Chase pulled back the sheet to reveal a young man's pale, lifeless face, a vicious gash across his temple. Keith swallowed hard. Even after all this time, he never quite got used to seeing the victims up close like this. "Blunt force trauma to the head?" Keith asked, keeping his tone carefully neutral. Chase nodded grimly. "Got clocked real good with a heavy, blunt object of some kind. Happened 2 nights ago on his way home from a coffee shop he frequented. No witnesses, no surveillance footage, no clear suspect. It's like this guy's a ghost." Keith nearly choked at the unintentional accuracy of that statement as Sarah started cackling madly behind him. He shot her a quelling glare before turning back to Chase. "Any clues at the crime scene? Anything out of the ordinary that might point to a motive?" "Nothing obvious. Just a blood-stained note that looks like it's from a woman based on the handwriting. Some flirtatious invitation to get together that weekend, signed June." A secret admirer, perhaps? Or a stalker? Keith mused, wheels turning. He could feel Sarah buzzing with anticipation next to him, eager to jump into Jerry's memories and play ghostly detective. My thoughts exactly, Chase sighed, scrubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw. Problem is, we haven't been able to track down this June. It's like she doesn't exist. Curiouser and curiouser, Sarah purred in Keith's ear. Shall we take a peek inside Jerry's head and see what he can tell us? Keith hesitated for a moment, but his reporter's curiosity won out. Chase, would you mind giving me a minute alone with the body? I'd like to see if I can pick up on any intuitive impressions that might spark an idea for you to follow up on. It was the cover story they always used, and Chase, bless him, never questioned it. Knock yourself out, Chase said distractedly, already moving towards the door. I need to make a few calls anyway. I'll be back shortly. As soon as the door clicked shut behind him, Sarah materialized fully, rubbing her hands together gleefully as she took up position at Jerry's head. Ready to solve a murder mystery? Ready as I'll ever be, Keith muttered, stepping up across from her and placing his hands reluctantly on Jerry's cold arm. He took a deep breath, clearing his mind as Sarah's ghostly energy began to flow through him, creating a bridge into Jerry's residual memories. The room spun dizzyingly for a moment before snapping into sharp focus. Keith blinked as harsh fluorescent light assaulted his eyes. He looked down at his hands resting on the counter and started slightly, seeing unfamiliar tan skin and well-manicured nails. He knew Jerry was standing at the register of a bustling coffee shop, the warm smell of roasted beans and sweet pastries filling the air. Here you go, Jerry. One large dark roast, extra hot, just like you like it, a bubbly feminine voice chirped. Keith looked up into sparkling green eyes framed by honey blonde hair. Her name tag read June with a smiley face sticker next to it. So this was the mystery woman. You know me so well, June, Jerry said warmly, and Keith could feel a flutter of nervous butterflies in his borrowed stomach. One of these days I'll work up the nerve to ask you out properly. June giggled and leaned forward conspiratorially. Well, maybe I'll make it easy for you and do the asking myself. I'm free this weekend if you want to grab dinner or something. Jerry grinned goofily. It's a date. As Jerry moved down the counter to wait for his drink, Keith felt a sharp prickle on the back of his neck, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. He turned surreptitiously, scanning the shop, but saw only the usual crowd of students and commuters tapping away on laptops, heads down. Pest! Over here, dummy, Sarah's voice sounded in his head, and he whipped around to see her peering at him around a pastry display, back in her usual ghostly form. Keith gave a subtle jerk of his chin in acknowledgement, not wanting to be seen talking to himself like a crazy person. Notice anything weird? He subvocalized under his breath. Sarah rolled her eyes. Besides you making googly eyes at the barista? Yeah. That sketchy-looking dude in the corner has been glaring daggers at the back of your head ever since you walked in. Keith casually angled himself to get a better look without being too obvious. The man was bundled in a dark hoodie, hunched over a table. All Keith could make out was a squarish jaw shadowed with stubble and angry, squinting eyes boring into him. As soon as the man noticed Keith looking, he quickly ducked his head and busied himself with his phone. Well, that's not suspicious at all, Keith muttered sarcastically. Just then, Jerry's name was called and Keith went to retrieve the drink, uncomfortably aware of the hooded man's eyes tracking his every move. He hurried out of the shop with Sarah floating along invisibly beside him. So what now? Tail him and wait for him to make a move? Sarah asked eagerly as they walked. Too risky, Keith said, shaking Jerry's head. We don't know if he's actually the killer or just some random creep. We need more to go on before we do anything rash. Sarah snorted inelegantly. You writers, always so cautious. Where's your sense of adventure? Some roughhousing might do Jerry boy good. Get the blood pumping so he can finally make a move on the coffee cutie. He's already dead, Sarah, Keith reminded her flatly. Not much blood pumping to be done at this point. Spoil sport, Sarah grumbled, but didn't push further. As they turned down a narrow alleyway, The hairs on the back of Keith's neck suddenly stood up. He spun around just in time to see the hooded man lunging out of the shadows, makeshift club raised high. On pure instinct, Keith threw himself to the side, and the heavy wooden plank smashed down right where he'd been standing a split second before. "Jerry, run!" Sarah yelled in his mind, and Keith didn't need telling twice. He sprinted down the alley, desperately looking for an escape route as the assailant's enraged howl echoed behind him. But they were in Jerry's memories, which meant the scene could only play out one way. Keith hit a dead end and stumbled as his toe caught on a loose cobblestone. In that moment of imbalance, the attacker caught up to him and brought the club down on his head with a sickening crack. Bright sparks of agony exploded behind Keith's eyes, and he crumpled to the filthy ground, fighting to stay conscious. Through blurred, fuzzy vision, he watched the killer roughly rummage through Jerry's pockets until he came up with a scrap of paper, June's note with her number. The man grunted in satisfaction and tucked it away before delivering one last brutal kick to Jerry's ribs and running off into the night. Keith, are you okay?" Sarah's panicked face swam into view above him, green eyes wide with concern. "Been better?" Keith croaked. And then the world dissolved into merciful darkness as Jerry slipped away. Keith came back to himself with a gasp, bracing his palms flat against the cool steel of the morgue table as the last tingles of phantom pain faded. He sucked in deep breaths, waiting for his racing heart to slow. "Well, that was a lot more excitement than I bargained for tonight," he said shakily, running a hand through his sweat-damp hair. "You're telling me," Sarah agreed, looking a bit shell-shocked herself. "For a minute there, I thought." "Yeah," Keith said simply, understanding all the things she couldn't quite say, that helpless terror of watching someone you cared about be brutalized. He'd experienced it 8 years ago with her, after all. Some scars never fully healed. He shook off the dark memories and focused back on the task at hand. So our killer definitely targeted Jerry because of his thing with June. Crimes of passion usually stem from jealousy or feelings of being threatened. "My money's on the barista having a psycho-stalker ex," Sarah declared with a sage nod. "Probably been harassing her for a while, saw her getting chummy with Jerry, and decided to eliminate the competition. Could be," Keith mused. "We still need to find June and get her side of things. See if she can give a description that matches the guy from the coffee shop. Leave that to me. I'll haunt her until she cracks," Sarah said with an unsettling amount of enthusiasm. At Keith's stern look, she held up her hands disarmingly. Kidding. I'll just do a little ghostly recon. Maybe nudge her in the police station's direction if she seems reluctant to come forward." "Fine, but be subtle," Keith warned. "The last thing we need is her getting suspicious and clamming up entirely." Sarah shot him a mock salute. "Subtlety is my middle name. Well, actually it's Eliza, but you get the point." Keith snorted softly. "Since when are you subtle?" Further banter was cut short by the sound of approaching footsteps. Chase, returning from his phone calls. Sarah vanished in a wisp of mist with a parting wink as Chase bustled back into the room, a glimmer of hope in his exhausted eyes. "Please tell me your psychic mojo came through, Keith. At this point, I'll take anything." Keith took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I think you need to track down the mystery woman, June. Something tells me she's the key to all this, even if she's not directly involved." Chase rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "You're thinking it might be someone from her life? A jealous ex or obsessive admirer who saw Jerry as a threat?" "Exactly. I'd start by staking out the coffee shop, see if any suspicious characters seem overly interested in her. In the meantime, I'll reach out to my contacts, see if they've heard any rumblings on the street about a violent stalking case." "You're a lifesaver, Keith," Chase said, clapping him on the shoulder. "I don't know how you do it, but I've learned not to question your hunches." Keith forced a smile, tamping down the ever-present flicker of guilt. If Chase knew the truth about his hunches, he'd probably run screaming in the other direction. Heck, Keith himself still questioned his own sanity most days. But if it helped put murderers behind bars and gave him fodder for his writing, well, he figured the ends justified the means. "Keep me posted," he told Chase as he gathered his coat. And be careful. We still don't know what this psycho is capable of. Hey, careful is my middle name, Chase quipped with a wry grin, unknowingly echoing Sarah. Keith raised a skeptical brow. Why don't I find that reassuring? It took another day and a half of legwork and ghostly espionage before they finally got the break they needed. Through a combination of Keith's underworld contacts and Sarah's invisible sleuthing, they discovered that June had recently taken out a restraining order against an ex named Billy Travers. According to court records, he'd been harassing her for months, ever since she broke things off after he put her in the hospital one too many times. The final nail in the coffin came when Chase, staking out the coffee shop as advised, snapped a photo of a man in a dark hoodie loitering outside and watching June through the window. When he showed it to Keith, he recognized him instantly as the angry man from Jerry's memories. "That's our killer," he told Chase confidently. "I'd bet my next book advance on it." With Keith's tip, Chase was able to pull Travers in for questioning. A quick comparison to the bloody partial print found on Jerry's body sealed the deal. Chase got a full confession in exchange for a plea deal, and the DA was confident they'd be able to put Travers away for a good long while. Another case closed, thanks to your uncanny skills, Chase crowed as they stood outside the courthouse after the sentencing hearing. "Seriously, Keith, have you ever considered joining the force? We could use a mind like yours." Keith laughed uncomfortably, rubbing the back of his neck. "If only Chase knew. I think I'll stick to the writing game. More lucrative and less paperwork." "Fair enough," Chase chuckled. He hesitated a moment, uncharacteristically serious. "Listen, Keith, I know I give you a hard time sometimes, but I really do appreciate everything you do. I don't know how you come up with this stuff, and frankly, I'm a little afraid to ask. But I trust you, and I'm glad you're in my corner." Keith swallowed past the sudden lump in his throat, both touched and pained by Chase's sincere words. The secrets he kept from his friend weighed on him, but he knew he could never reveal the full truth. Living souls weren't meant to meddle in the affairs of the dead. "Thanks, Chase. That means a lot," Keith managed to say around the tightness in his chest. "I'm just glad we were able to get justice for Jerry and keep June safe from that creep." Chase nodded solemnly. "You and me both. Though I gotta admit, I feel a little bad for her. Losing a promising new relationship before it even really started, and under such awful circumstances, that's gotta be rough." "Yeah," Keith sighed, his mind drifting back to the giddy butterflies he'd felt in Jerry's stomach when June had flirted with him, the goofy grin that had stretched his cheeks, a spark of potential snuffed out too soon by a madman's jealousy. The parallels to his own past made his heart ache. He knew all too well the pain of hopes and happiness shattered in an instant. Seeming to sense his melancholy, Chase gave him a bolstering slap on the back. "Hey, at least she's got closure now. And who knows, maybe this will give her the push she needs to take a chance on happiness again someday, once she's had time to heal. Jerry would want that for her." "I'm sure he would," Keith agreed, mustering a smile. They said their goodbyes and Keith started the trek back to his apartment, hands shoved deep in his pockets and mind churning. Sarah materialized beside him, floating along in companionable silence for a block before speaking. "Penny for your broody thoughts?" she lilted, cocking her head at him. Keith huffed a wry laugh. "Just thinking about missed opportunities, I guess. The might-have-beens that haunt us. Paths not taken, things left unsaid. Chances we're too afraid to take until it's too late." Sarah gave him a long, searching look. "This is about more than just Jerry and June, isn't it?" Keith didn't answer, just hunched his shoulders and kept walking. Sarah sighed, drifting in front of him. "Keith, we've been over this. What happened to me wasn't your fault. You can't keep blaming yourself for things you had no control over." "Can't I?" Keith bit out, a bitter twist to his mouth. "If I hadn't been such a coward back then, if I just told you how I really felt instead of playing it safe, maybe." "Maybe nothing," Sarah interrupted firmly. "You're not omniscient, Keith. You had no way of knowing what was going to happen that night. And even if you had confessed some grand romantic feelings for me, it wouldn't have changed the fact that some drunken dirtbag decided to rob the convenience store and shoot the only witness. Keith flinched at the blunt recounting of the worst night of his life. Finding his best friend and secret crush bloodied and barely breathing on the dirty linoleum. The life leaking out of her even as he desperately tried to staunch the flow. It still haunted his nightmares, even with Sarah's spirit by his side when he woke. "I should have been there," he whispered hoarsely, eyes stinging. "I should have walked you home like I wanted to, instead of chickening out because I was too nervous about being alone with you." Sarah softened, her ghostly hand hovering over his cheek in a phantom caress. "Oh, Keith, always trying to carry the weight of the world. But I'm glad you weren't there. Knowing you, you probably would have tried to play hero and gotten yourself killed right alongside me. And that would have destroyed me far more than any bullet." Keith swallowed hard, turning his face into her not-quite touch. "I miss you, Sarah, the real you. As much as I cherish our partnership now, it's just not the same as having you here, alive and whole." "I know," Sarah said gently. "I miss me too. Believe me. But we can't change the past, only how we live with it. I died, and it sucks, but I've made my peace with that. I've embraced this ghost gig and all the exciting new possibilities it brings, like helping you catch bad guys and giving you writing mojo. And most importantly, I get to stay by your side, even if it's not in the way either of us hoped for. That's enough for me." She fixed him with a mock-stern look. "But it won't be enough if you keep wallowing in guilt and grief over me forever. You're still alive, Keith. You deserve to really live. Not just go through the motions because you feel obligated to the dead girl haunting you. Nah, don't even start with the 'I can't possibly move on' martyr nonsense. Jerry and June are proof that life is too damn short for that. Honor my memory by embracing happiness when you find it. Fall in love again. Start a family. Do all the things I didn't get a chance to. Live for both of us. That's what I want, more than anything." By the time she finished her impassioned speech, they had reached Keith's building. He stared up at the darkened windows of his lonely apartment, suddenly unbearably weary of the solitary half-life he'd been clinging to. Sarah was right. It was time to stop just surviving and start thriving again. He turned back to her with a tremulous smile. "I'll try," he promised. "For you and for me. No guarantees I'll succeed, but I'll try." Sarah beamed at him, brighter than any living soul. "That's all any of us can do. And hey, you've already got a great start. The ghostwriter and his spirit sleuth solving crimes and spinning stories. We make a hell of a team, if I do say so myself. The future's looking pretty darn bright from where I'm floating." Keith laughed, and for once, the sound held more joy than sorrow. He still had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time, he felt something like hope kindling in his chest. His ghosts would always be with him, but maybe, just maybe, he was finally ready to start living again.